In the winter of 1944, the Baltic region once again became a focal point of the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. For the German leadership, Estonia was more than just another segment of the collapsing Eastern Front. It was a buffer zone shielding the approaches to East Prussia and the Reich's northern flank, while also providing vital access to the Baltic Sea for naval operations and the remnants of the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet. For the Soviet Union, the capture of Estonia was an essential step in securing its northwestern frontier, restoring control over territories lost in 1941, and opening the way for future operations into East Prussia and Finland. The impending battle around the Narva River would therefore become both strategically and symbolically charged, drawing in a wide range of forces, from German regular divisions to volunteer formations recruited from across occupied Europe. The events at Narva cannot be understood in isolation from the broader course of the Eastern Front. By January 1944, the Wehrmacht was reeling from a succession of defeats. The encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad the previous winter, followed by the loss of Kursk in the summer of 1943, had eroded both manpower and morale. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Georg von Küchler, had long been cut off from the main German front lines, linked to the rest of the Reich only by tenuous supply routes. When the Red Army launched the Leningrad-Novgorod Offensive in January 1944, the German position in the Baltic became increasingly untenable. The siege of Leningrad was broken after nearly 900 days, and Soviet forces surged westward, threatening to overrun Estonia. In response, Adolf Hitler demanded that the Narva Line be held at all costs, turning this relatively small river valley into a major defensive stronghold. For the Soviets, the liberation of the Baltic states was embedded in wider strategic objectives. Joseph Stalin had ordered the destruction of German forces in the northern sector of the front to secure Soviet ports on the Baltic, and to demonstrate to the Western Allies that the Red Army could reclaim all Soviet territory. The Second Baltic Front and the Leningrad Front were reinforced with fresh troops and equipment, fielding armies that collectively numbered over 25,000 men for the Narva offensive. They brought with them substantial artillery, armor, and air support, reflecting the Soviet Union's growing industrial superiority and capacity for large-scale offensive operations. On the German side, the defenses were organized under Army Group North, which by early 1944 had been weakened by prolonged fighting and losses in men and materiel. To bolster their position, the German High Command relied increasingly on Waffen-SS formations, composed not only of German soldiers, but also of volunteers from across occupied Europe. Among the most notable were the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, composed largely of Estonian conscripts and volunteers, as well as the 11th SS Volunteer Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland, which included Danes, Norwegians, and other Scandinavian recruits. These divisions, together with elements of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe field units, created a composite force of around 5,000 to 6,000 men tasked with halting the Soviet advance at the Narva River. The local population in Estonia faced a complex and perilous situation. Many Estonians had initially welcomed the German occupation in 1941, viewing it as liberation from Soviet rule, which had included mass deportations and political repression. By 1944, however, disillusionment with German policies, forced conscription, and economic exploitation was widespread. Civilians were caught between two advancing armies, with evacuation, flight, or conscription into military units often the only available options. For some, service in German-sponsored units was framed as a defense of Estonian soil against Soviet reoccupation. For others, it was coerced under threat of punishment. Meanwhile, Soviet authorities, preparing to re-establish control, emphasized narratives of liberation and revenge, mobilizing political commissars to frame the campaign in ideological as well as military terms. Intelligence on both sides influenced how the coming battle unfolded. German commanders, aware of their numerical inferiority, concentrated on fortifying natural defensive barriers along the Narva River and constructing extensive trench systems, minefields, and bunkers. The Red Army, confident in its momentum after breaking the siege of Leningrad, underestimated the resilience of the German and SS defenders. Soviet intelligence assessments suggested that the German forces were exhausted and near collapse, encouraging ambitious operational plans aimed at rapid breakthroughs and encirclements. In reality, German troops were determined, bolstered by a mix of ideology, desperation, and the belief that holding the Narva line was critical to buying time for the Reich. As the stage was set in early 1944, both sides braced for a confrontation that promised to be among the most intense in the Baltic theater. For the Soviets, it was an opportunity to drive the Germans from Estonian soil and advance toward the borders of East Prussia. For the Germans and their allies, it was a fight for survival, one last attempt to maintain a foothold in the north, and to demonstrate that the Eastern Front could still be held. The convergence of these opposing objectives ensured that the coming Battle of Narva would not only be prolonged, but also bitterly contested, with consequences that extended far beyond the river's banks. The opening phase of the Battle of Narva began in late January 1944, when the Soviet Leningrad front, commanded by General Leonid Govorov, advanced westward after the siege of Leningrad had been broken. The momentum of Soviet operations was immense. Armored units, supported by artillery barrages and close air support, moved rapidly toward the Estonian frontier. The Soviet command believed that the German defense would collapse quickly under the weight of this offensive, allowing a swift advance to Tallinn and the Baltic coast. In their planning, Narva was seen not only as a military objective, but as a gateway to cutting off German Army Group North entirely. On January 26th, forward elements of the Soviet Second Shock Army reached the outskirts of Narva, encountering German outposts and rear guards. These initial clashes revealed that the Germans had consolidated their forces along the river line, preparing to make a determined stand. The Narva River, though narrow in places, offered a natural defensive barrier, augmented by frozen conditions in winter that made movement difficult but predictable. Bridges and crossing points immediately became focal targets for both sides. The Germans destroyed infrastructure to delay the Red Army, while the Soviets attempted to force crossings under artillery fire. Command structures on both sides played a critical role in shaping the initial engagements. On the German side, Army Group North had been placed under Field Marshal Walter Model, a commander known for strict discipline and skill in organizing defensive battles. Under him, the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, led by SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner, held responsibility for the Narva sector. Steiner's corps brought together a combination of experienced German SS units and multinational volunteer divisions, a unique composition that reflected both the manpower shortages of the Reich and the ideological emphasis placed on the Waffen-SS. Among the formations were the 11th SS Nordland Division and the 20th Estonian SS Division, whose local recruits saw themselves as defending their homeland from renewed Soviet rule. The Soviet command assembled a much larger force, with the Second Shock Army and the 59th Army forming the vanguard. These forces included several rifle corps, tank brigades, and specialized engineer units tasked with bridging frozen rivers and clearing obstacles. Soviet artillery units deployed thousands of guns along the front, launching bombardments designed to shatter German defensive lines. Air support came from the 13th Air Army, which sought to dominate the skies over Narva and disrupt German supply routes. In total, the Soviets committed around 25,000 men in the initial offensive against a German force of fewer than 6,000. The first week of fighting centered on attempts to breach the German river defenses. Soviet units launched frontal assaults across the ice, often under heavy fire from entrenched German machine guns and artillery. Losses mounted quickly, but the Red Army persisted, testing multiple crossing points to exploit any weakness. German engineers laid extensive minefields and fortified bunkers, turning small villages and farmsteads along the river into strong points. These fortified positions slowed the Soviet advance, forcing costly battles for control of narrow approaches and river crossings. Civilians in the region were drawn into the conflict almost immediately. Villages near the front were evacuated by German authorities, while many others fled voluntarily, fearing the return of Soviet rule. The destruction of infrastructure, bridges, railways, and supply depots disrupted not only military logistics, but also civilian life. Estonian civilians who remained often found themselves pressed into service as laborers, repairing defenses or assisting with supply transport. For many, survival depended on navigating between the demands of two armies locked in a struggle over their homeland. Despite Soviet numerical superiority, the German lines did not break in the opening phase. Instead, the Red Army found itself entangled in a series of attritional engagements, suffering heavy casualties and repeated attempts to establish bridgeheads. German defensive tactics emphasized elastic resistance, with counterattacks launched by small, mobile reserves to contain penetrations. The role of multinational SS units became particularly prominent, as their commanders sought to demonstrate their reliability in combat despite their varied backgrounds. By the first week of February, it was clear that the battle would not be resolved quickly. The Soviets had expected to advance rapidly into Estonia, but instead encountered a protracted defense that tied down large numbers of men and resources. For the Germans, holding the Narva line became a matter of strategic necessity as well as propaganda, portrayed as proof that the Eastern Front could still be stabilized. The stage was set for a drawn-out confrontation in which both sides would escalate their efforts, leading to some of the fiercest fighting in the Baltic theater of the war. The strategic goals and planning of both sides in the Battle of Narva reflected the wider realities of the Eastern Front in early 1944. For the Soviet Union, the offensive against Narva was a continuation of the Leningrad-Novgorod campaign, designed to secure the approaches to the Baltic Sea and remove German Army Group North from Estonia. Joseph Stalin and the Soviet High Command, Stavka, emphasized that the Baltic states had to be retaken, not only for military reasons, but also for political ones. Reclaiming Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would restore Soviet territorial integrity as it existed before 1941, and strengthen the Soviet position in post-war negotiations with the Western Allies. Narva, lying directly on the road to Tallinn and guarding the corridor between Lake Peipus and the Gulf of Finland, thus became a critical operational target. The Soviet plan centered on a rapid breakthrough of the German defensive line along the Narva River, followed by a deep penetration westward toward Tallinn. The Leningrad Front under General Govorov and the Second Baltic Front under General Andrei Eremenko coordinated their operations to exert maximum pressure on Army Group North. The immediate tactical objective was to establish bridgeheads across the Narva River that could support mechanized forces. To achieve this, the Soviets concentrated large numbers of artillery pieces. By February 1944, more than 2,500 guns and mortars were deployed along the sector, and prepared mass infantry assaults supported by tank brigades. Soviet commanders believed that numerical superiority, combined with overwhelming firepower, would inevitably break the German line. On the German side, planning was constrained by Hitler's directive that no ground was to be ceded voluntarily in the Baltic. The Führer insisted that Estonia remain under German control, both to protect the northern flank of the Reich and to maintain access to critical naval bases, particularly those at Tallinn and along the Gulf of Finland. These bases were essential for submarine operations in the Baltic, which in turn were connected to the larger Battle of the Atlantic. Furthermore, Estonia provided access to vital natural resources and transportation corridors. For Hitler, the loss of Estonia would not only be a military setback, but also a political and symbolic defeat. Field Marshal Model and SS Obergruppenführer Steiner were tasked with translating these political imperatives into a viable defense. Recognizing that they could not match Soviet manpower, they relied on natural defensive terrain and elaborate field works. The Narva River, with its swampy banks and forested surroundings, was turned into a fortified line supported by multiple layers of trenches, machine gun nests, and minefields. German engineers constructed strong points at key villages, turning them into miniature fortresses designed to delay Soviet advances. Behind the front, reserve positions were prepared to allow for flexible withdrawals while maintaining overall cohesion. Logistics and supply presented enormous challenges for both sides. The Soviets had to sustain large forces through difficult terrain during winter conditions. Frozen rivers and snow-covered roads slowed supply convoys, while German air and artillery attacks targeted Soviet transport routes. The Red Army relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons and improvised bridging equipment, but the sheer weight of artillery ammunition and fuel demanded efficient coordination. Conversely, The Germans depended on increasingly strained supply lines that stretched back through Latvia and into East Prussia. Allied bombing campaigns against rail networks in Germany further hampered the delivery of reinforcements and supplies. By February 1944, shortages of fuel and ammunition were already limiting German operational flexibility in the Narva sector. Propaganda played a significant role in shaping how the battle was presented to both domestic and foreign audiences. Soviet propaganda emphasized the liberation of Estonian lands and framed the campaign as part of the larger struggle to defeat fascism. Political commissars within frontline units reinforced ideological motivations, reminding soldiers of the atrocities committed during the German occupation and presenting the offensive as an act of justice. Meanwhile, German propaganda highlighted the multinational character of the defenders, portraying the Waffen-SS divisions from Estonia, Denmark, Norway, and other countries as proof of a united European front against Bolshevism. For Estonian recruits in particular, the narrative was framed as a defense of their homeland against a return of Soviet control. Miscalculations also shaped the planning on both sides. Soviet intelligence assessments underestimated the defensive capacity of Steiner's SS Panzer Corps, leading to expectations of a rapid collapse that did not materialize. German planners, meanwhile, underestimated the scale of Soviet resources that could be committed to the Narva sector, leading to situations where their defensive lines were nearly overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers. Both sides entered the battle with assumptions that would be tested severely in the weeks ahead. As preparations concluded in February 1944, the stage was set for an extended confrontation. The Soviet Union intended to drive west in a decisive push, while the Germans sought to delay, bleed, and hold their positions for as long as possible. Both strategies were rooted in necessity. For the Soviets, time meant momentum and political advantage. For the Germans, time meant survival and the chance to regroup elsewhere. Narva thus became not only a battlefield, but also a test of endurance, planning, and the capacity of each side to sustain operations under increasingly difficult conditions. The clash at Narva began in earnest in February 1944, when Soviet forces launched repeated attempts to establish a foothold across the river. The first major assaults came on February 2nd, as units of the 2nd Shock Army and the 59th Army pushed forward under the cover of heavy artillery barrages. Soviet infantry advanced across the frozen river in mass formations, while engineer units attempted to lay pontoon bridges to allow tanks and heavy weapons to cross. Yet despite meticulous preparation, the attacks quickly revealed the resilience of the German defensive system. The Narva Line, manned by the N3 SS Panzer Corps, resisted with concentrated fire from artillery, mortars, and machine guns positioned to cover likely crossing points. Entire Soviet battalions were cut down on the ice, and pontoon bridges were destroyed before they could be completed. The early engagements turned into a grim pattern of advance and counterattack. Soviet forces would push forward to seize a foothold on the western bank, only to be met by German counterattacks launched by small, mobile reserves. These counterstrokes, often involving Waffen-SS units supported by assault guns, aimed not to retake wide swathes of territory, but to contain Soviet bridgeheads before they could expand. This tactic forced the Soviets into costly localized battles that achieved little strategic gain. Nevertheless, through sheer persistence, the Red Army eventually managed to secure several small bridgeheads north and south of Narva, particularly near the village of Riigiküla. The fighting around these bridgeheads was especially fierce. Soviet commanders threw wave after wave of rifle divisions into the attacks, supported by Katyusha rocket barrages and close air support from the 13th Air Army. German defenders, including Estonian SS volunteers of the 20th Division and Scandinavian troops of the Nordland Division, fought from fortified trenches and bunkers. In some sectors, combat devolved into close quarters fighting with grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets as the Soviets attempted to clear strong points one by one. By mid-February, both sides had suffered heavy casualties, with the Soviet forces losing thousands of men in failed crossing attempts, and the Germans expending scarce reserves to prevent a breakthrough. Civilians living in the Narva region endured great hardship during these initial engagements. Villages caught between the lines were shelled and burned, forcing residents to flee. German authorities evacuated some populations westward into Estonia, while others were left to face Soviet advances. For Estonians, the choice was agonizing: to remain under German occupation, which involved forced labor and conscription, or to risk the return of Soviet control, which carried memories of deportations and political repression from 1940–41. Some Estonians joined German-sponsored units as a means of defending their homes, while others awaited the Red Army as a force of liberation. These divergent experiences illustrate the complex civilian dimension of the battle, in which survival and loyalty were often dictated by circumstance rather than ideology. The early weeks also tested morale on both sides. For the Red Army soldiers, the high casualty rates in frontal assaults created frustration and exhaustion. Commissars emphasized the political importance of liberating Estonia, urging persistence despite losses. For German troops, the psychological strain of holding against overwhelming numbers was considerable. Reports from German commanders highlighted the exhaustion of frontline units and the difficulty of replacing losses, but also noted the determination of the multinational SS divisions, which sought to prove their combat effectiveness. Estonian units in particular were portrayed by German propaganda as fighting for national survival, even as many of their men had been conscripted against their will. By the end of February, the front had settled into a bloody stalemate. The Soviets controlled limited bridgeheads on the western bank, but had been unable to achieve the breakthrough that Stavka had demanded. German forces remained in control of Narva itself and the main defensive line, but at the cost of severe attrition. Both sides began preparing for the next phase of the campaign, bringing in reinforcements and reorganizing their units. The clash had already demonstrated that Narva would not be a short engagement. Instead, it was evolving into a prolonged battle of attrition, one that would tie down tens of thousands of troops and shape the course of the Baltic front for months to come. As the winter turned toward spring, the initial Soviet expectation of a rapid advance had faded. The Germans, though heavily outnumbered, had shown that with prepared defenses and disciplined counterattacks, they could blunt even the most determined assaults. The opening engagements at Narva set the tone for what was to follow, a series of brutal localized battles marked by high casualties, shifting front lines, and the persistent struggle for control of narrow strips of territory. This deadlock foreshadowed the escalation that would soon transform the Narva front into one of the most fiercely contested sectors of the Eastern Front in 1944. The escalation of the Battle of Narva took shape in March 1944, when both sides committed additional forces in an effort to break the deadlock that had developed along the river. For the Soviet High Command, the inability to achieve a decisive breakthrough in February was a source of frustration. Stalin had expected the Narva line to collapse quickly, opening the road to Tallinn and beyond. Instead, the Germans, supported by Baltic SS divisions and reinforced positions, continued to hold. Stavka therefore ordered renewed assaults with larger concentrations of men and materiel. The Red Army increased its strength in the sector to more than 14,000 troops, supported by hundreds of tanks and over 800 aircraft. The goal was to expand the bridgeheads and force a rupture in the German line that could be exploited by mechanized forces. On the German side, the worsening situation on other parts of the Eastern Front meant reinforcements were scarce. Nevertheless, the Narva sector remained a priority for Hitler, who insisted it be defended at all costs. The 3rd SS Panzer Corps, under Felix Steiner, was reinforced with additional artillery and a limited number of armored vehicles, including Sturmgeschütz assault guns. The defenders totaled around 5,000 to 6,000 men, many of whom were stretched thin across a long defensive line. The multinational composition of these forces, Estonian conscripts, Scandinavian volunteers, and regular German units, added complexity to command and logistics, yet their cohesion held under extreme pressure. The escalation was marked by intensified artillery bombardments. Soviet guns unleashed massive preparatory barrages designed to obliterate German trenches and bunkers. Entire villages along the Narva front were reduced to rubble under shell fire. These bombardments were followed by infantry waves, supported by tanks attempting to push across the frozen terrain. The Germans responded with concentrated defensive fire, including pre-registered artillery strikes that rained down on Soviet assembly areas. The river and its adjacent marshes became killing zones, littered with destroyed equipment and bodies as each side fought for control of relatively small patches of ground. One of the most critical areas of fighting was the Soviet bridgehead south of Narva, near the village of Krivasoo. Here, Soviet forces established a firm lodgment that posed a constant threat of outflanking German positions. Repeated German counterattacks were launched to contain and, if possible, eliminate this bridgehead. These assaults often involved night operations, using local knowledge of forests and terrain to surprise Soviet units. Despite these efforts, the Soviets managed to hold their ground, reinforcing the bridgehead with additional troops and equipment. The German inability to eradicate this foothold meant that the front remained under continuous pressure. Weather and terrain compounded the difficulties. The thawing of ice in March turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Tanks became bogged down in mud. Supply convoys struggled to reach the front, and soldiers endured harsh conditions with inadequate shelter. Disease and exhaustion took their toll on both armies. For the Soviets, the challenge was to sustain offensive momentum in an environment where logistical breakdowns were frequent. For the Germans, it was a matter of survival, holding lines despite shortages of food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Reports from the front describe soldiers digging makeshift shelters in frozen ground, living in conditions little changed from the First World War. Civilian populations in the region faced escalating hardships. As the fighting intensified, German authorities expanded evacuations, moving tens of thousands of Estonians westward. Some civilians were pressed into labor to maintain roads or construct fortifications, while others fled on their own, often caught in artillery fire or aerial bombardments. The Soviet Air Force increasingly targeted rear areas, striking towns and supply depots far behind the front line. For those Estonians who remained, life became a daily struggle to find food and shelter amid the devastation. Politically, the fighting around Narva had wider implications. For the Soviets, every delay in taking Narva meant postponement of larger strategic objectives, including cutting off German Army Group North and exerting pressure on Finland to exit the war. For the Germans, holding Narva allowed them to maintain contact with their forces in northern Latvia and to preserve the possibility of continued operations in the Baltic. The multinational nature of the German defense was also exploited in propaganda, which depicted Narva as a symbol of European unity against Bolshevism. Soviet propaganda countered by highlighting the sacrifices of Red Army soldiers in liberating Estonian territory, framing the conflict as a patriotic struggle to reclaim the homeland. By late March, casualties on both sides had mounted to staggering levels. The Soviets had lost tens of thousands of men in repeated assaults, while German units suffered heavily in defending their positions. Neither side achieved a decisive breakthrough, but the battle had escalated into a prolonged and bloody confrontation that drained resources and morale. The Narva front had become a war of attrition, with both armies locked in a struggle that promised only further losses in the months ahead. The crisis was far from resolved, and the coming spring would bring even larger operations as each side sought to tip the balance in its favor. The peak of the Narva campaign came in April and May 1944, when both sides concentrated their resources in what became the most intense phase of the battle. After weeks of costly but inconclusive assaults, the Soviet High Command shifted tactics to focus on encirclement attempts. Stavka believed that the destruction of the German forces along the Narva River would open the way not only to Tallinn, but also to the rapid collapse of Army Group North. To achieve this, Soviet planners committed additional rifle divisions and mechanized units, pushing the total strength in the sector to more than 15,000 men. They also increased the use of heavy artillery and launched sustained air operations to isolate the battlefield from German supply routes. The German position, although precarious, remained intact. The 3rd SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Felix Steiner, held the line with around 5,000 men, including the 11th SS Division Nordland, the 20th Estonian SS Division, and supporting Wehrmacht units. Their defensive system was a patchwork of trenches, bunkers, and fortified strongpoints, many of which had been constructed with civilian labor. The Germans also benefited from the natural obstacles of the Narva River and surrounding forests, which limited the maneuverability of Soviet armored units. Despite shortages of men and equipment, the defenders continued to resist, relying on flexible counterattacks and local initiative. April saw one of the largest Soviet offensives of the campaign, focused on expanding the bridgeheads south of Narva and cutting off the German garrison in the city itself. Massive artillery bombardments preceded infantry assaults, with entire sectors of the front engulfed in fire. German units endured bombardments lasting several hours, after which Soviet rifle divisions advanced in dense formations. In several areas, Soviet troops succeeded in overrunning the first line of defenses, only to be driven back by counterattacks launched by German reserves, often supported by assault guns and flamethrowers. The result was a series of bloody seesaw battles that left the landscape devastated and casualties mounting on both sides. Air power played a growing role in this stage of the battle. The Soviet 13th Air Army conducted hundreds of sorties daily, bombing bridges, rail junctions, and supply depots in an effort to disrupt German logistics. German fighters from Jagdgeschwader 54, Grünherz, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced units, attempted to contest Soviet air superiority, but fuel shortages and declining aircraft numbers limited their effectiveness. Both armies relied heavily on close air support, with Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix and German FW-190s carrying out low-level attacks that added to the destruction of the battlefield. Civilians were caught in the crossfire more than ever during this peak phase. Narva itself was largely destroyed by artillery fire and air raids. In March 1944, a series of Soviet air raids had already reduced much of the medieval city to ruins, and by spring, it was almost entirely depopulated. Evacuations carried out by German authorities removed thousands of residents, but many others were trapped in surrounding villages where fighting raged. The devastation of Narva became symbolic of the wider destruction across Estonia, where towns and countryside alike bore the scars of relentless warfare. Within the German ranks, morale was mixed. The multinational character of Steiner's corps brought together soldiers with different motivations: Estonians and Latvians defending their homeland, Scandinavians motivated by ideological or anti-Soviet sentiment, and German regulars fighting for survival. Propaganda sought to maintain unity by framing the battle as a decisive stand for Europe's future, but reports from the front described fatigue, shortages, and the constant strain of combat. Soviet troops, too, faced enormous psychological pressures, as repeated assaults resulted in high casualties with limited progress. Commissars stressed the necessity of sacrifice, but soldiers often found themselves fighting over the same ruined villages and trenches day after day. One of the defining engagements of this period was the fighting around the so-called Narva bridgehead, south of the city. Here, Soviet forces attempted to widen their lodgment into a launching point for a breakthrough. The Germans responded with Operation Bagration, a counter-offensive aimed at reducing the Soviet foothold. In April, elements of the Estonian division and Nordland launched coordinated attacks, supported by artillery and limited armored assets. Although the Germans inflicted heavy losses and temporarily reduced Soviet positions, they could not eliminate the bridgehead entirely. The persistence of this Soviet foothold ensured that the pressure on Narva would continue into the summer. By May 1944, both armies were nearing exhaustion. The Soviets had poured immense resources into the sector, but failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The Germans, though heavily outnumbered, still held their positions, but their situation remained precarious. Casualties were staggering. Estimates suggest that Soviet losses by this stage had exceeded 5,000 men, while German forces had lost tens of thousands killed, wounded, or missing. Despite these costs, neither side could disengage. For the Soviets, victory at Narva was essential for strategic momentum. For the Germans, holding the line was critical to preserving the Baltic front and delaying the advance into the Reich's northern territories. The peak of the campaign thus highlighted the brutal nature of the struggle for Narva, a prolonged confrontation in which terrain, logistics, and sheer determination mattered as much as numbers or technology. Both armies were locked into a war of attrition, and the outcome remained uncertain. Yet it was increasingly clear that the balance of resources favored the Soviet Union, and the question was not whether the Germans could hold indefinitely, but how long they could delay the inevitable advance westward. As the battle dragged into the summer of 1944, both sides were forced to adapt to the relentless pressures of attrition. For the Germans, the overriding priority was to maintain a continuous defensive line despite dwindling manpower and supplies. The 3rd SS Panzer Corps, under Felix Steiner, relied heavily on improvisation. Units that had been reduced to fragments were merged, rear echelon personnel were pressed into frontline service, and weapons were salvaged from destroyed vehicles to equip infantry strongpoints. The Estonian units, particularly the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division, played a growing role in holding the line. Their familiarity with the terrain allowed them to exploit forests, marshes, and villages for defensive advantage, though their numbers were increasingly thinned by casualties and desertion. German tactics emphasized resistance through flexibility. Instead of rigidly holding every trench, commanders developed a system of elastic defense, allowing Soviet attacks to advance into prepared zones before counterattacking. This method aimed to inflict maximum losses while conserving limited resources. Sturmgeschütz, assault guns, and small mobile reserves were shifted rapidly to crisis points, compensating for the lack of large armored formations. Mines and obstacles multiplied along the front, forcing Soviet units into costly, deliberate assaults. Reports from German field officers described the front as a continuous cycle of Soviet attacks, followed by desperate counterblows, with little respite for either side. The Soviets also adapted their approach. After months of costly frontal assaults, Stavka encouraged more coordinated operations, combining artillery, armor, and infantry. Engineers played an increasing role, building bridges under fire and clearing minefields to facilitate deeper penetrations. Soviet commanders began employing deception measures, launching diversionary attacks to stretch German reserves thin. However, the fundamental challenge remained. Breaking through the Narva line required overwhelming force, and even modest gains demanded heavy sacrifices. By June, the Soviets had expanded their bridgeheads south of Narva, but still faced a coherent German defense blocking the road to Tallinn. Partisan activity added another dimension to the campaign. In Estonia's forests, Soviet partisans disrupted German supply routes, sabotaged railways, and ambushed convoys. Their operations tied down German rear area units and undermined the already fragile logistics supporting the Narva front. At the same time, German security forces and local collaborators launched counter-partisan sweeps, often targeting civilian populations suspected of aiding resistance fighters. This cycle of violence deepened the hardships for rural communities, caught between partisan and counter-partisan warfare. Resource management became increasingly decisive. The Soviets benefited from immense reserves of men and equipment flowing from the interior, while German forces depended on overstretched supply lines extending back through Latvia and East Prussia. Allied bombing of German rail networks further disrupted deliveries, leading to shortages of ammunition and fuel at the front. In many cases, German artillery was forced to ration shells, while Soviet batteries maintained sustained barrages. Food shortages also plagued the German ranks, with rations reduced and soldiers relying on requisitioning from local populations. Soviet troops endured their own privations, but the vast logistical apparatus of the Red Army ensured that replacements and supplies, though delayed, continued to arrive. Psychological strain weighed heavily on both armies. German soldiers faced the reality that the Reich was losing the war, even as they were ordered to hold ground at all costs. Desertion and self-inflicted wounds became more common, though SS units were closely monitored to maintain discipline. Estonian conscripts often found themselves fighting under duress, torn between fear of German punishment and dread of Soviet reoccupation. For Soviet soldiers, repeated assaults against entrenched defenses produced frustration and despair. Yet, political commissars maintained pressure to press forward. Diaries and letters from the front reveal a shared experience of exhaustion, fear, and determination, regardless of which uniform a soldier wore. Civilian life during this phase was marked by constant dislocation. Villages near the front were abandoned or destroyed, their populations evacuated westward by the Germans or driven eastward by Soviet advances. Thousands of Estonian civilians sought refuge across the Baltic Sea in Finland or Sweden, fearing both German retreat and Soviet return. Those who remained often endured forced labor, food requisitions, and the threat of bombardment, farms and infrastructure were devastated, leaving a legacy of destruction that would persist long after the battle ended. By the middle of 1944, the Narva front epitomized resistance and adaptation under extreme conditions. The Germans demonstrated remarkable defensive resilience despite overwhelming odds, while the Soviets displayed persistence and growing tactical sophistication. Neither side achieved decisive success, but the continuous struggle bled both armies. The Soviets retained the strategic initiative, but their inability to crush the Narva defenses outright delayed larger operations planned for the summer. For the Germans, every day of resistance bought time, but at the cost of mounting casualties and the erosion of combat power. The campaign's psychological and logistical dimensions underscored its significance beyond the battlefield. For Soviet planners, Narva became a proving ground for methods that would later be applied in the Great Summer Offensives. For the Germans, it symbolized a desperate holding action, an improvised stand that slowed but could not ultimately prevent the advance of the Red Army. The months of adaptation and attrition prepared the ground for a coming turning point, when the balance would finally shift in favor of the attackers. The turning point of the Battle of Narva arrived in the summer of 1944, when the Soviet High Command launched a renewed and concentrated offensive that finally overwhelmed the German defenses. By July, Stavka had committed the Leningrad front, reinforced with fresh divisions, additional artillery brigades, and armor, to achieve what months of attritional fighting had failed to deliver. The aim was no longer simply to widen bridgeheads, but to break the entire German line, encircle Narva, and advance toward Tallinn. The operation coincided with larger Soviet summer offensives across the Eastern Front, including Operation Bagration in Belarus, which threatened to collapse German defenses on a massive scale. For the Germans, the situation had become untenable. The 3 SS Panzer Corps, under Felix Steiner, was still tasked with holding the Narva line, but by July, its manpower was severely reduced. Many divisions were at half or less of their authorized strength, and replacements were scarce. Ammunition shortages were chronic, and the Luftwaffe could provide only limited air support. Nevertheless, Hitler continued to insist that Narva be defended. Viewing the loss of Estonia as unacceptable, orders were issued to hold every position, regardless of cost. Steiner and his officers faced the near-impossible task of obeying these directives while contending with overwhelming Soviet superiority. The Soviet assault began on July 24, 1944, with one of the heaviest artillery bombardments yet seen on the northern sector of the Eastern Front. Thousands of guns pounded German positions for hours, reducing bunkers and trenches to rubble. Following the barrage, Soviet infantry surged forward across a broad front, supported by armor and close air support. The main thrust was directed at the southern sector of the Narva line, where Soviet planners believed the weakened German defenses could be penetrated. At the same time, diversionary attacks were launched elsewhere to pin down reserves and prevent their redeployment. The German defenders fought with determination, but the scale of the assault soon created crises along the front. Soviet rifle divisions, backed by tanks and engineers, forced crossings over the Narva River and pushed into rear positions. Despite local counterattacks, German units were steadily driven back. The Estonian 20th Waffen Grenadier Division, which bore much of the fighting, sustained particularly heavy losses. Scandinavian volunteers of the 11th SS Nordland Division likewise suffered devastating casualties in attempts to plug breaches. Reports described instances of entire companies being wiped out as Soviet artillery and infantry overwhelmed strong points that had resisted for months. By July 25th, Soviet troops had succeeded in breaking through south of Narva, threatening to encircle the city. Steiner requested permission to withdraw, but Hitler's orders to hold were only reluctantly modified. Finally, faced with the danger of total encirclement, German commanders began a staged withdrawal from Narva itself. On July 26th, after months of bombardment and street fighting, the city fell to Soviet forces. Narva, already almost completely destroyed by artillery and air raids, was left in ruins. Soviet soldiers raised their flags over the shattered city, marking a symbolic victory after half a year of grinding combat. The capture of Narva represented not only a tactical success, but also a psychological turning point. For the Soviets, it demonstrated the effectiveness of their strategy of concentration and coordination, validating lessons learned in earlier phases of the battle. It also freed Soviet forces to continue their advance westward, threatening Tallinn and the rest of Estonia. For the Germans, the loss of Narva marked the collapse of a defensive position that had tied down enormous Soviet resources. The withdrawal, though orderly in places, left German forces exposed and forced them into a fighting retreat toward new defensive lines along the Tannenberg Line, located west of Narva. Civilian consequences of the turning point were severe. Narva's population had largely been evacuated or killed, and the city itself was unrecognizable. Villages in the surrounding area had been burned and agricultural land devastated. Tens of thousands of Estonians fled westward with retreating German forces, fearing Soviet reoccupation. At the same time, Soviet authorities prepared to reassert control, re-establishing administrative structures and integrating the regained territory into the wider campaign to restore Soviet governance over the Baltic. The strategic repercussions extended beyond Estonia. The collapse of the Narva front coincided with the destruction of German Army Group Center in Belarus during Operation Bagration, creating a broad crisis for the Wehrmacht across the Eastern Front. For Army Group North, retreat from Narva meant relinquishing the last major defensive barrier before central Estonia. Though the Germans regrouped at the Tannenberg Line and mounted a temporary stand, the loss of Narva marked a decisive shift in momentum. The battle that had consumed months of resources and tens of thousands of lives had ended in Soviet victory, paving the way for the liberation and reoccupation of the Baltic states. Thus, the turning point in July 1944 was not only the fall of a city, but the collapse of a defensive strategy. The Narva Line had served its purpose as a delaying position, but it could not withstand the full weight of Soviet summer offensives. From this moment onward, the Germans were in retreat, and the Red Army held the initiative in the Baltic theater. The consequences for soldiers, civilians, and the future of Estonia would unfold in the chaotic months that followed. By August 1944, the Battle of Narva had drawn to its bloody conclusion, but the consequences of the campaign continued to unfold in the aftermath of the German retreat. The fall of Narva and the Soviet breakthrough forced Army Group North to withdraw to the prepared Tannenberg Line, a fortified defensive system west of Narva designed to delay the Red Army's further advance into Estonia. Here, German troops, including the remnants of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, attempted to stabilize the front. The defense of the Tannenberg Line, while fierce, was ultimately a delaying action rather than a bid to regain the initiative. It underscored that the German presence in Estonia was collapsing under the pressure of the larger Soviet summer offensives. The withdrawal from Narva was conducted under fire and exacted a heavy toll. German rearguards engaged in constant skirmishes as Soviet forces pursued across rivers and forests, targeting retreating convoys and columns. Bridges were destroyed to slow the Red Army's pursuit, while mines and rearguard ambushes inflicted losses. Yet, despite these measures, the Soviets pressed relentlessly, eager to prevent the Germans from forming a coherent line. By late July, Soviet spearheads were already threatening the approaches to Tallinn, forcing the Germans to commit what remained of their reserves. The humanitarian consequences of the retreat were severe. Tens of thousands of Estonian civilians fled westward with the German forces, fearing the return of Soviet rule. Many joined refugee convoys heading toward Latvia, or sought passage across the Baltic Sea to Finland or Sweden. German authorities facilitated some of these evacuations, but also conscripted civilians into labor details, delaying their departure. Those who remained faced immediate re-Sovietization. Political commissars re-established local Soviets, and security organs began identifying collaborators and potential opponents of Soviet rule. Arrests and deportations soon followed, adding another layer of trauma to a population already devastated by years of war. For the German troops, the retreat marked the end of a 6-month ordeal in which they had endured repeated assaults and staggering casualties. The multinational SS formations that had defended Narva were severely depleted. The 20th Estonian Division suffered particularly heavy losses, while the 11th SS Nordland Division was reduced to a fraction of its former strength. German units, too, had been bled white. with many battalions existing only on paper. The retreat to the Tannenberg Line preserved their remnants for further fighting, but the ability of Army Group North to hold Estonia was clearly gone. The Red Army's occupation of Narva and pursuit of German forces westward was accompanied by both celebration and hardship. Soviet propaganda declared the liberation of Estonian territory, presenting the victory as part of the broader summer successes across the Eastern Front. Red Army units, however, were exhausted and had sustained massive casualties in achieving the breakthrough. Supplies lagged behind the advancing spearheads, and engineers were required to rebuild destroyed infrastructure to maintain momentum. Nevertheless, the Soviet advance had achieved its main objective, the removal of the Narva line as a barrier and the opening of the road into central Estonia. Strategically, the aftermath of Narva signaled the collapse of German defensive coherence in the Baltic region. The loss of the city and its river line coincided with catastrophic defeats elsewhere, particularly in Belarus, where Operation Bagration destroyed Army Group Center. This dual crisis left the German High Command struggling to allocate reinforcements. For Army Group North, the retreat from Narva meant a gradual contraction into Latvia and ultimately into the Courland Pocket, where remnants would be cut off later in the year. The Baltic states, once considered part of Hitler's secure rear area, were now on the verge of being overrun. For the local population, the end of the battle was not liberation in the sense of restored independence, but the return of Soviet control. Estonians who had supported or served under German occupation faced reprisals. Political purges, arrests, and deportations began almost immediately, targeting not only those who had collaborated, but also intellectuals, clergy, and nationalist activists. The Soviet Union reimposed collectivization policies and integrated Estonia back into the Soviet administrative system. For many civilians, this second occupation was as disruptive and traumatic as the first, cementing the war's legacy of displacement and repression. Thus, the aftermath of Narva revealed both the immediate military consequences and the broader human cost. The German retreat preserved fragments of their forces for further resistance, but conceded strategic ground that could not be recovered. The Soviet advance secured political objectives, but imposed new burdens on a war-torn population. The battle's conclusion set the stage for the final phase of fighting in Estonia, as the war shifted westward and the Baltic region became a theater of retreat, evacuation, and occupation. The destruction of Narva and the suffering of its people became emblematic of the wider devastation experienced by the Baltic states in the last years of the Second World War. The legacy of the Battle of Narva is complex, shaped by military, political, and cultural dimensions that extended far beyond the battlefield itself. Militarily, the battle represented one of the last major defensive stands of Army Group North, before its retreat into Latvia and eventual isolation in the Courland Pocket. For 6 months, German and Waffen SS forces, including multinational divisions composed of Estonian, Latvian, and Scandinavian volunteers, had managed to delay the Red Army, despite overwhelming numerical and material superiority. Their defense of the Narva line became an example of how tactical skill, terrain, and determined resistance could stall but not ultimately prevent strategic defeat. The eventual Soviet breakthrough demonstrated the growing operational sophistication of the Red Army, which combined massed artillery, coordinated infantry assaults, and mechanized exploitation in ways that reflected the lessons of earlier failures. Politically, the outcome of the battle sealed the fate of Estonia and the other Baltic states for decades to come. The Soviet Union, having retaken Narva in July 1944, quickly re-established control over Estonia. This advance was part of Stalin's larger strategy to restore pre-1941 Soviet borders and to ensure political dominance over Eastern Europe in the post-war order. The return of Soviet power brought sweeping changes, reimposed collectivization, the persecution of political and cultural elites, and mass deportations of those deemed collaborators or potential opponents of Soviet rule. For many Estonians, the battle's end meant the replacement of one occupying power with another, and the start of a long period of integration into the Soviet Union that lasted until 1991. The memory of Narva was shaped differently depending on perspective. In the Soviet narrative, the battle was portrayed as a heroic liberation, part of the wider sequence of victories that culminated in Berlin. Soviet histories emphasize the sacrifices of Red Army soldiers and the destruction of fascist strongholds in the Baltic. The devastation of Narva itself, largely destroyed by artillery and bombing, was presented as the necessary cost of defeating the German occupiers. In contrast, German and émigré accounts often highlighted the stubbornness of the defense, presenting Narva as a European Thermopylae, where outnumbered defenders, including foreign volunteers, had held back the Soviet advance for months. In Estonian memory, the battle remains particularly divisive. Some view the conscripts of the 20th Waffen-Grenadier Division as patriots defending their homeland against Soviet reoccupation, while others emphasize the coercion and exploitation involved in their recruitment under Nazi rule. The cultural impact of the battle was reinforced by its sheer destructiveness. Narva, once one of the most architecturally significant cities in the Baltic region, with its medieval old town and Baroque buildings, was reduced almost entirely to rubble. Post-war Soviet reconstruction did not restore its historic character. Instead, much of the city was rebuilt in a utilitarian Soviet style. As a result, the physical scars of the battle became a lasting reminder of the war's devastation, shaping local identity and memory. For Estonians, the ruins of Narva symbolized both the loss of heritage and the tragedy of being caught between two totalitarian powers. The battle's broader significance lies in its role within the shifting balance of the Second World War. Narva was one of a series of defensive actions that delayed but could not stop the Soviet advance into Eastern Europe. Its outcome contributed to the isolation of Army Group North, which by the autumn of 1944 would be trapped in the Courland pocket, cut off from the rest of the Wehrmacht until the end of the war. For the Soviet Union, victory at Narva underscored the irreversible momentum of its Western offensives. The Red Army had demonstrated its ability to dismantle fortified lines, sustain massive assaults, and achieve strategic objectives despite high casualties. These capacities would be brought to bear later that year in operations that liberated the rest of the Baltic and pushed into East Prussia. In the decades that followed, the Battle of Narva remained a point of contention in historical interpretation. In Soviet historiography, it was celebrated as part of the liberation of the Baltic peoples from fascism. In exile communities, particularly among Estonian émigrés, it was remembered as a tragic struggle in which young conscripts were forced to fight for a cause not their own, yet simultaneously as an episode of national defense against Soviet domination. In Germany and Scandinavia, veterans' memoirs contributed to the mythologization of Narva as a last stand, feeding into broader debates about the role of the Waffen-SS and the nature of collaboration. Ultimately, the legacy of Narva reflects the entangled realities of the Second World War in the Baltic. It was a battle fought by multinational forces on territory contested by two empires, with civilians caught in between. It left behind ruins, demographic upheavals, and contested memories that shaped regional politics for generations. For military historians, it illustrates the dynamics of late war operations on the Eastern Front, the interplay of defense and offense, the costs of attrition, and the limits of both German resilience and Soviet offensive power. For the people of Estonia, it symbolizes the tragedy of being a battleground for larger powers, their national aspirations subsumed in the clash of competing totalitarian regimes. The ruins of Narva and the stories of those who fought and suffered there remain a testament to the complexity and devastation of the war in the Baltic theater.